On the morning of April 9, 1288, the Bạch Đằng River was obscured by a dense mist. Through this hazy veil, a formidable fleet of 400 Mongol warships advanced in a predetermined pattern. Their vessels cut through the water with the unwavering confidence of an empire that had subjugated half the known world. At the lead ship's bow stood Admiral Omar, the son of Yunnan's governor, a seasoned veteran of the Song dynasty's downfall and arguably the Yuan dynasty's most accomplished naval commander. He peered towards the river exit and the boundless sea beyond, certain that his fleet would reach safety within a few hours. Behind him lay the aftermath of a failed invasion. Ahead, he envisioned home and the opportunity to regroup for another assault on the resilient Vietnamese. The tide was at its peak, and the water flowed deep and swiftly beneath his ships. The path seemed clear. Then, from the swirling fog, several small Vietnamese junks emerged. Compared to his colossal warships, they were insignificant, perhaps a tenth of their size, crewed by men who had been in constant retreat for months. They launched a few volleys of arrows, more of a nuisance than a true attack, before executing Omar's precise expectation. They turned and fled. A faint smile touched Omar's lips. "Pursue them," he commanded. "Annihilate them before they reach the tributaries." His captains required no further urging. The massive Yuan dynasty warships surged forward, their oars beating a synchronized rhythm, pushing deeper into the river. The Vietnamese boats scattered before them like prey before predators, their smaller hulls somehow expertly navigating the progressively narrowing channel with desperate speed. The Mongol vessels followed, their commanders eager for a final victory to salvage some prestige from their disastrous campaign. The Vietnamese boats continued their flight, and the Mongol ships relentlessly pursued. Deeper and deeper into the river they went, the banks gradually closing in on both sides. And beneath the surface of that rising morning tide, a weapon lay concealed, invisible to every man aboard those 400 warships. A device Admiral Omar had dismissed as crude. A weapon from 350 years prior. A weapon that in a matter of hours would obliterate the world's most formidable navy. But what Omar, and indeed none of his men, failed to comprehend as they chased those fleeing Vietnamese vessels further into the Bạch Đằng, was that their fates were already sealed. The only remaining question was how long it would take for them to realize it. Let me elaborate on Admiral Omar. To truly grasp the devastating and perfectly ironic events that transpired at Bạch Đằng, one must deeply understand the man himself. Omar bin Nazalan al-Bari was no mere court appointee dabbling in warfare. This man had forged his reputation through bloodshed and conflict. His father, the Mongol-appointed Khwarezmian governor of Yunnan, meant Omar matured within the imperial system, gaining an intrinsic understanding of power. Yet, unlike many born to privilege, Omar had distinguished himself on the seas. During Kublai Khan's conquest of the Song dynasty, Omar commanded the vanguard fleet that relentlessly pursued the remnants of Chinese naval power from Guangxi all the way down the coast. He had confronted and defeated Chinese admirals who possessed a millennium of shipbuilding and sailing expertise. When the Song launched their final, desperate counterattack on Guangzhou in July of 1278, it was Omar who repelled them. He possessed an intimate knowledge of naval warfare, much like a master artisan intimately understands his tools. In 1285, during the second Mongol incursion into Vietnam, Omar had personally driven the Vietnamese king into the sea. He had forced King Tran Nha Nong from the coast near Hoang, nearly capturing him in April of that year. The monarch of an entire nation had fled before Omar's ships. This illustrates the caliber of naval prowess we are discussing. Therefore, when Kublai Khan orchestrated his third invasion of Vietnam in 1287, entrusting Omar with command of the naval forces alongside Generals Fanny and Mahmud, it was not an emotional or political decision. It was a cold, calculated judgment. If anyone possessed the capability to break Vietnamese resistance by sea, it was this individual. His force comprised 500 warships, 18,000 Marines, 70 transport vessels, and tens of thousands of sailors. This was not a mere raiding party. It was an armada meticulously designed to crush a nation. And initially, it unfolded precisely as planned. The two-pronged invasion, commencing in late 1287, was monumental, even by Mongol benchmarks. Prince Togon, Kublai's own progeny, led between 100,000 and 170,000 troops overland from Guangxi and Yunnan. Omar's fleet sailed from Quanzhou, aiming to execute a colossal pincer movement to compel Vietnam's submission. The force encompassed Mongols, Jurchens, Han Chinese from 4 distinct provinces, Yunnanese soldiers, former Song troops who had defected, and even 17,000 Li troops from Hainan. This represented the full might of the Yuan dynasty, the inheritors of Genghis Khan's empire, brought to bear against a relatively small Southeast Asian kingdom. Had you inquired of any military strategist of that era about the likely victor, they would have probably regarded your question as a sign of lunacy. On February 3, 1288, Prince Togon's military forces marched into Thang Long, the former Vietnamese capital now identified as Hanoi. His soldiers filed through the city gates, weapons poised for the anticipated final resistance. Instead, they encountered only profound quiet. The metropolis stood deserted, not in a chaotic, hasty abandonment with scattered belongings and open doors, but emptied with meticulous, intentional planning. The granaries had been completely cleared, and the warehouses held nothing but dust. Every morsel of food, every essential tool, every piece of material an army might require had disappeared. The Vietnamese monarch was gone, as was his court and his army. The entire civilian population had dispersed into the countryside, vanishing like morning dew beneath the sun. This was a scorched earth strategy executed with remarkable precision, leaving Togon with a trophy of no value. An army exceeding 100,000 soldiers cannot subsist on mere pride and captured territory, and the Vietnamese had ensured there was nothing else available. Then, the true ordeal commenced. The Vietnamese chose not to engage in direct battle, or rather, they refused to fight in the manner the Mongols desired. There were no grand pitched battles, no climactic confrontations where superior Mongol cavalry and tactics could determine the outcome. Instead, there were ambushes, nocturnal raids, bridges collapsing under the weight of supply carts, and roads abruptly terminating in impassable swamps. A ceaseless, unrelenting harassment denied the invaders any respite. The intense tropical heat, a constant for the Vietnamese, afflicted the Mongol soldiers with physical force. Men who had conquered the steppes of Central Asia and the plains of China found themselves utterly depleted merely by existing in this humid, steaming environment. Disease proliferated through the encampments. Supply lines, already tenuous, became even more fragile, transforming into vulnerable threads that Vietnamese guerrillas severed with increased regularity. Then, in January 1288, the first major catastrophe struck. General Tran Con Du, commanding a Vietnamese naval contingent stationed at Van Don Island near Ha Long Bay, had been observant and patient. Upon receiving intelligence that a massive Yuan supply fleet, commanded by Jiang Wenhu and consisting of 70 vessels laden with the provisions Togon's starving army desperately needed, was approaching, he acted. With 30 warships, the Vietnamese assailed Jiang's supply fleet like predators attacking wounded prey. They incinerated it all. 70 ships, transporting 7 million kilograms of rice and supplies, transformed into blazing pyres illuminating Ha Long Bay. Some of Jiang's remaining ships were driven off course by powerful northeast monsoon winds, while others drifted aimlessly amidst the chaos. Jiang himself was forced to retreat all the way back to Hainan Island. When King Tran Nanong heard the news, he instantly comprehended its significance. Quote 3, he declared. Quote 4, the Mongol army in Thang Long, exceeding 100,000 strong, began to starve. On March 5th, Togon abandoned the capital he had seized barely a month prior, retreating to the Yuan base at Van Keep. By March 30th, his situation deteriorating daily, he ordered a full withdrawal to China. His army, once the pride of the Yuan dynasty, now resembled a defeated mob more than a conquering force. The Vietnamese harried them at every turn. At Langon, around April 10th, Prince Togon himself was struck by a poisoned arrow. He had to abandon his warship and escape through the forests on foot, accompanied by the few loyal and capable troops remaining. Most of his land army was annihilated or captured during that nightmarish retreat. However, Omar's fleet remained intact, which made him dangerous. 400 warships represented too significant a power to simply disregard. Even in retreat, they could shell coastal positions, transport the remnants of the ground forces, or form the core of yet another invasion attempt. Omar needed to return those ships to China, and there was only one practical route: down the Bạch Đằng River to the open sea. Omar felt assured as his fleet entered that river on the morning of April 9th. Why wouldn't he? He had vanquished the Song dynasty's navy. He had driven kings into the ocean. His ships were undamaged, his crews seasoned, and his escape path clear. Yes, the overall campaign had been a catastrophe. Yes, Togon had failed utterly on land, but Omar would salvage the fleet, and the fleet could be redeployed. And he had no inkling that a 60-year-old Vietnamese general named Tran Hung Dao had spent the past month preparing something extraordinary for him. Something Omar, in his skill, experience, and self-assurance, had dismissed as a primitive-era tactic. He was about to discover that sometimes ancient methods endure because they are effective. Approximately 350 years prior to Admiral Omar's arrival in the Bạch Đằng River, a Vietnamese military leader named No Quinn encountered a comparable predicament on these very shores. The year was 938 AD. His adversary was the Southern Han Dynasty, a Chinese state that had maintained dominion over Vietnam for such an extended period that the notion of independence seemed almost mythical. And indeed, Quinn had just witnessed a formidable enemy fleet entering this very estuary, intending to suppress yet another Vietnamese uprising and reassert Chinese control. What Quinn did subsequently dismantled a millennium of Chinese imperial rule and became the stuff of legend. He had his soldiers anchor sharp wooden stakes in the riverbed, hundreds, perhaps thousands, with their iron-tipped ends angled upstream towards the river's mouth. At high tide, these stakes disappeared beneath the water, imperceptible to any vessel sailing above them. Then Quinn dispatched a small flotilla of agile Vietnamese boats to provoke the Southern Han fleet. The boats engaged, then retreated upstream, and the Southern Han, anticipating an easy victory, pursued with their substantial warships. The tide shifted, the water receded, and abruptly, those wooden stakes emerged from the river, resembling the fangs of some colossal submerged creature. The Southern Han vessels, too cumbersome to halt or maneuver swiftly, impaled themselves on these stakes. Hulls ruptured, ships overturned. Soldiers and sailors, weighed down by their armor, drowned while Vietnamese archers positioned on the banks decimated anyone attempting to swim to safety. The Southern Han prince, Liu Hongkao, perished along with the majority of his forces. That singular engagement terminated Chinese sovereignty over Vietnam. Quinn crowned himself king in 939 and relocated his capital to Co Loa, a locale symbolizing traditional Vietnamese monarchy preceding the Chinese conquest. The message was unequivocal. Vietnam was once again Vietnamese, and it would remain so for centuries. The Battle of Bạch Đằng in 938 solidified itself as the cornerstone military legend of Vietnamese autonomy. Every Vietnamese child learned about those stakes. Every military officer analyzed the strategies. And when Vietnam confronted repeated invasions in the ensuing centuries, commanders referenced that battle for inspiration. However, there's a particular aspect regarding legendary tactics from bygone eras. By the 13th century, during the Mongol campaigns, wooden stakes in a riverbed appeared antiquated, rudimentary, akin to something from a simpler era before modern warfare had advanced beyond such unsophisticated methods. The Mongols had subjugated half the globe, deploying sophisticated military strategies that would elicit admiration from contemporary generals. This included combined arms tactics, coordinating cavalry, infantry, and siege weaponry. Psychological warfare that instilled terror in enemies, compelling surrender before a single arrow was loosed. Intelligence networks that meticulously charted enemy territories and pinpointed weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. Colossal siege engines capable of reducing fortified cities to rubble. Composite bows that could deliver fatal blows from seemingly impossible distances. And nascent forms of gunpowder weaponry. Their naval expertise was procured from subjugated Chinese shipwrights and mariners. This was the military force that had decimated the Khwarezmian Empire, conquered Russia, ravaged Eastern Europe, and ultimately brought down the Song dynasty after decades of intricate military operations. These were not barbaric hordes. They constituted the most formidable military apparatus the medieval world had ever witnessed. And Omar epitomized that sophistication. He had mastered naval combat from Chinese experts, then surpassed them in their own domain. He commanded ships that embodied centuries of technological advancement. His crews had participated in battles all along the Chinese coastline. When Omar scrutinized Vietnamese defenses, he viewed them through the lens of an individual who had studied and surmounted advanced military systems. So, when intelligence reports indicated that the Vietnamese might attempt to employ the ancient Bạch Đằng stratagem, reports that almost certainly reached Omar's attention at some juncture during the campaign, what do you imagine he concluded? Envision it from his standpoint. You're the admiral instrumental in conquering the Song dynasty. You've pursued Vietnamese monarchs into the sea. You command 500 of the subcontinent's most advanced warships, and someone suggests you should be concerned about wooden poles in a river. The Southern Han dynasty, which No Qin defeated in 938, was a regional power barely controlling southern China during a period of imperial fragmentation. Omar embodied the Yuan dynasty at the zenith of its power, governing the most extensive contiguous empire in human history. The Song dynasty, which Omar helped vanquish, possessed war junks that were technological marvels, featuring multiple decks, intricate sail configurations, and even rudimentary forms of naval artillery. And the Vietnamese believed wooden stakes would impede Yuan warships. It must have appeared preposterous, ludicrous even, like bringing a knife to a gunfight, or in this instance, employing medieval tactics in a 13th century naval engagement. But here's what Omar failed to grasp. His extensive knowledge, experience, and self-assurance concealed a critical detail from him. The Bạch Đằng River was the pivotal element. This was no mere watercourse. The Bạch Đằng was an estuary, stretching over 2 kilometers wide at its mouth, where the fresh water from numerous tributary rivers merged with the saline waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. As is characteristic of all estuaries, it experienced powerful tidal shifts, yet the Bạch Đằng tides were exceptionally pronounced. From midnight until morning, the tides surged with remarkable speed. Water levels could ascend by several meters, transforming shallow regions into deep channels, concealing rocks, sandbanks, and any other features on the riverbed. The current during the rising tide flowed swiftly and powerfully, pushing upstream with a force that could make a ship struggle against its oars. Then, around midday, the tide reversed its direction. The water didn't just recede, it withdrew with the same vigorous speed it had risen. Within hours, deep channels became shallow again, sandy seabeds reappeared, and anything anchored to the riverbed that had been submerged safely at high tide suddenly became a hazard, obstructing the path of any vessel that hadn't departed in time. The riverbed itself was irregular, rocky in places, with multiple tributary rivers feeding into the main channel. The Bạch Đằng flowed through a rugged, mountainous area, generating unpredictable currents and whirlpools, a true nightmare for navigators, even without hostile forces. For the nimble Vietnamese boats, designed over generations to navigate these specific waters, the Bạch Đằng was their familiar domain. They understood the routes of the deep channels and how to interpret the currents. Crucially, they knew precisely the required clearance and where to find it. However, for the heavy UN warships, vessels engineered for open ocean warfare and deep harbors, commanded by sailors from China's coast who had never sailed these particular waters. The Bạch Đằng was a covert trap. They remained unaware of this, though, and this brings us to another point about centuries-old tactics. If they are still discussed after 350 years, there is usually a compelling reason. When Trần Hưng Đạo, at the age of 60, resolved to revive a weapon from the era of his distant ancestors, this might not seem exceptionally old to us. Yet, in the 13th century, when most men considered themselves fortunate to reach 40, 60 was truly an advanced age. He had already bested the Mongols once in 1285, employing guerrilla warfare and scorched earth tactics to drive them back across the border. He had earned the esteemed title of Supreme Commander of all Vietnamese military forces and had demonstrated his acumen, which makes the subsequent events even more extraordinary. Because when Trần Hưng Đạo unveiled his strategy to his generals in March of 1288, they must have believed the old man had finally lost his senses. The scene at the Ha River is documented in Vietnamese historical records. Trần Hưng Đạo assembled his commanders and made a solemn pledge, one that would put not only his reputation, but his very life on the line for what was to follow. Quote 5. He vowed before them all, quote, "It was the kind of dramatic pronouncement that either elevates one to legendary status or serves as a cautionary tale of hubris. There is no middle ground when you publicly swear never to retreat." He then presented his plan. They would employ wooden stakes driven into the Bạch Đằng riverbed to decimate Omar's fleet. I can only imagine the profound silence that greeted this announcement, as everyone present was familiar with the tale of No Quinn. And everyone in that chamber also recognized that 350 years had elapsed since that time. Naval warfare had evolved, ship construction had progressed. The Mongols were not the southern Han. This was, after all, the Yuan dynasty, the people who had conquered China and were, at that moment, attempting to conquer Japan with the largest amphibious invasion fleet in history up to that point. The unspoken query must have lingered in the air. Wooden stakes? Seriously? Is that our chosen method? Trần Hưng rejoinder, as far as I can piece it together from historical accounts, was effectively this: yes, wooden stakes. Because while Omar contemplates advanced tactics and sophisticated naval maneuvers, while he plans for the type of battle he understands, we will defeat him with a weapon so ancient he has forgotten its existence. He then elucidated the practical workings of his plan, and suddenly it no longer appeared so outlandish. First, the tidal analysis. This was not merely a generalized awareness of tidal movement. Trần Hưng Đạo dedicated weeks to meticulously studying the precise tidal patterns of the Bạch Đằng. He needed to ascertain exactly when high tide would peak, precisely when the water would begin to recede, its rate of descent, where the deepest channels would persist during low tide, and where the riverbed would become exposed. He needed to know the water levels for every hour of the day. This was a matter of scientific precision, not conjecture or superstition. Trần Hưng Đạo was essentially performing a thorough hydrographic study, utilizing the instruments and techniques of the 13th century. He measured, calculated, and timed everything with meticulous accuracy. This painstaking precision was crucial because the entire strategy hinged on flawless timing. A slight miscalculation by a few hours, either too early or too late, would result in Omar's fleet spotting the submerged stakes before entering the danger zone or escaping before the tide receded enough to ensnare them. The window for success was incredibly narrow, demanding minute-by-minute choreography. Subsequently, the focus shifted to the production of the stakes, where Trần Hưng Đạo meticulousness truly shone through. He didn't just instruct his men to fell trees and sharpen them. He specified particular wood varieties, ironwood, which the Vietnamese called lim, along with tau and senwood. These were the hardest timbers available in Vietnam, chosen for their resistance to rot and softening even after weeks submerged in brackish water, and their ability to endure the constant pressure of tidal currents without breaking or shifting. The stakes ranged from 2 to 5 meters in length, with their lower sections sharpened to facilitate driving them into the riverbed. Some were encased in iron tips to enhance their lethality and durability. Their tops were intentionally left jagged or rough, rather than smooth, to rip and tear hulls instead of merely puncturing them. Crucially, Tran Hung Dao orchestrated the installation of these stakes at various angles. Some stood vertically, pointing straight up, while others were angled at 15 degrees, facing west. Still others were inclined at 45 degrees, facing south towards the river mouth. This was not arbitrary. It ensured that regardless of the direction a ship attempted to turn or evade the stakes once they became visible, additional stakes would be positioned to intercept it from a different angle. The stakes were arranged in a zigzag formation, forming a massive Z across the riverbed, with individual stakes spaced approximately 0.9 to 1.5 meters apart. This spacing was close enough to necessitate careful navigation even for smaller boats, yet wide enough that at high tide, when the stakes were hidden, the river would appear completely normal to anyone sailing over them. Next came the most challenging phase, actually embedding these formidable obstacles. Stakes could only be driven into the riverbed during low tide when the bottom was exposed. This gave Tran Hung Dao's laborers limited daily windows to complete the task. Furthermore, it was March in northern Vietnam, characterized by cold rain, harsh northeastern winds, and generally dismal working conditions. Historical records explicitly mention that the workers installed these stakes in freezing rain, underscoring the extraordinary discipline and dedication required. They faced the daunting task of installing hundreds, possibly thousands of stakes across multiple locations. The primary stake fields were situated in 3 tributary rivers, the Chan, Ken, and Rut, all flowing into the Bạch Đằng from the north. Additional stake fields were established at Ke Quai near Hiep and at Yen Gua in Quang Ninh Province. This was not a single point of constriction, but a series of interconnected kill zones designed to funnel Omar's fleet into an inescapable trap. All of this had to be executed in absolute secrecy. If word of these preparations reached Omar, or if one of his scouts detected the stakes at low tide, the entire plan would crumble, and the Vietnamese would have revealed their strategy and squandered weeks of arduous labor. Consequently, the work proceeded quietly and meticulously, with security so stringent that even many Vietnamese soldiers were unaware of what was being prepared. Finally, Tran Hung Dao deployed his military forces. The smaller Vietnamese fleet, destined to lure Omar into the trap, concealed itself behind An Kok Reef and other natural features, out of sight from the river mouth. Ground forces were positioned along both banks of the Bạch Đằng, camouflaged within the vegetation and behind natural terrain. They readied fire arrows, accumulated stones for throwing, and gathered flammable materials to hurl onto enemy vessels. Everyone took their assigned positions and waited. Consider what Tran Hung Dao accomplished here. He was 60 years old, confronting an admiral who had contributed to the conquest of the Song dynasty, commanding a fleet that was a mere fraction of the size of the force he was about to engage. The odds were so overwhelmingly stacked against him that even his own generals likely harbored doubts. Yet, Tran Hung Dao comprehended something that Omar, despite all his expertise, did not. He understood that the fundamental essence of warfare lies in matching the appropriate tool to the specific situation. Omar had brought advanced warships designed for open ocean combat. Tran Hung Dao had brought a river, tidal science, wooden stakes, and patience. If this contest were determined by who possessed superior ships, Omar would emerge victorious. If it were a test of who had more naval combat experience, Omar would win. If the contest were about crew proficiency or the sheer number of vessels, Omar would invariably come out on top. However, Tran Hung Dao wasn't engaging Omar in any of those types of confrontations. Instead, he presented Omar with a straightforward decision: navigate the Bạch Đằng River at high tide, or seek an alternative route. Omar, confident in his fleet, his personnel, and his own leadership, opted for the river passage. Occasionally, the most significant military triumphs aren't achieved by the faction possessing superior technology. They are secured by the side that possesses a deeper understanding of the battleground. Omar was the seasoned expert, but Tran Hung Dao was defending his home territory. This distinction profoundly impacted the outcome. Allow me to recount the precise events of April 9, 1288, because the minute details are crucial, and comprehending the unfolding of these events will allow you to fully grasp the masterful precision with which Tran Hung Dao orchestrated this catastrophe. The day commenced shrouded in fog. While not uncommon for a spring morning in an estuary, its density was such that visibility was restricted to merely several hundred meters. Omar's armada navigated the Bạch Đằng as the tide swelled, reaching its near-peak water levels. Had you been positioned on the deck of one of those vessels, gazing into the depths, you would have perceived nothing but a dark, rapidly flowing river below you. Seemingly devoid of obstructions, the fleet advanced in formation. 400 warships, accompanied by support vessels and thousands of troops, represented the pinnacle of Yuan naval might in Southeast Asia. They had been in retreat for several days, relentlessly harried by Vietnamese forces, and every individual aboard these ships yearned for nothing more than to reach the open sea and return home. The mouth of the Bạch Đằng lay ahead, likely discernible through gaps in the mist, promising an escape from this wretched land that had swallowed their invasion. Then, from within that fog, Vietnamese boats emerged. They were few in number, perhaps 20 or 30 light junks, diminutive in comparison to the colossal Yuan warships. They materialized from tributary channels and from behind dense reed beds, unleashing arrows as they advanced. This was not a serious assault, but rather a continuation of the harassment campaigns they had waged for weeks. Minor skirmishes that irritated more than they inflicted damage. It was the kind of defiance one would anticipate from a vanquished adversary making a final, desperate gesture. Omar's officers scarcely required directives. They instinctively knew how to address retreating Vietnamese craft: pursue, overtake, annihilate. The vessels surged forward, oars vigorously churning the water, sails catching the sporadic breeze that pierced the fog. It felt gratifying to finally undertake an offensive action after weeks of withdrawal. It evoked a sense of reasserting dominance. The Vietnamese boats fled, and crucially, their flight was remarkably convincing. These were not vessels engaged in a fighting retreat, pausing to fire and then withdrawing to re-engage. These were boats seemingly in a state of sheer panic, their crews rowing furiously for their lives, opting for any trajectory that offered the swiftest escape from the pursuing warships. They appeared defeated. They appeared terrified. They appeared precisely as Omar had anticipated they would. Consequently, the fleet pursued them further upstream into the river. The Vietnamese vessels retreated upriver, following the primary channel, and the Mongol ships followed suit. They were now fully committed, the entire fleet moving as a cohesive unit, captains vying to be the first to corner the enemy. The riverbanks gradually narrowed on either side, though not dramatically. This remained a broad waterway, offering ample room for naval maneuvers. There seemed to be no cause for concern. The Vietnamese persisted in their retreat. The Mongols continued their pursuit. Minutes bled into an hour. The hour extended further. And all the while, Tran Hung Dao, observing from his vantage point along the riverbank, awaited a singular event: the turning of the tide. It arrived around mid-morning, that subtle alteration when the water ceases its ascent and commences its almost imperceptible descent. Unless one were specifically monitoring for it, it would go unnoticed. The current reversed direction, transitioning from pushing upstream to pulling towards the sea. The water level, which had appeared constant, began to recede. The Vietnamese boats sustained their withdrawal, but now their flight began to exhibit greater organization, as if they were adhering to specific routes, navigating through tributary mouths, utilizing channels that seemed to become progressively narrower and shallower as the morning unfolded. Some of Tranhunga's commanders, those who discerned the unfolding situation, started to disengage from active combat. They had sustained their losses, fulfilled their roles, and now it was time to exit the danger zone. The Mongol fleet persisted in its chase. They were too deeply embroiled to turn back, and besides, why would they? The Vietnamese were directly ahead, finally confronting them instead of fleeing into the interior. A few more moments, and they would be within arrow range. A few more after that, and hand-to-hand combat would ensue, where Mongol discipline and training always prevailed. Then, someone on one of the leading vessels felt an object scrape along the bottom of the hull. It was merely a slight graze as the vessel brushed against an underwater sandbar. The captain likely ordered a minor course correction, nothing significant, just enough to avoid the obstruction they'd encountered. Then, another ship scraped its bottom, followed by yet another. Somewhere within that fleet, presumably on his flagship, Admiral Omar must have experienced the initial jolt of understanding. He would have scanned the water level, observed the riverbanks, which now appeared somewhat elevated compared to an hour prior, and noted how the nimble, shallow-draft Vietnamese junks continued their unimpeded movement, while his cumbersome warships began to feel the riverbed. The tide was ebbing, and at that precise moment, the inaugural wooden stake pierced the surface. Visualize it. A dark, roughly hewn form, perhaps 3 or 4 inches in diameter, ascending from the water like an accusatory digit. One stake, then another, then 10, then hundreds, materializing across the entire river channel as the water receded, revealing what had been concealed for weeks. The realization must have struck the UN commanders with physical force. These weren't natural impediments. They were meticulously placed wooden stakes. Someone had intentionally embedded them in the riverbed, and this discovery surely prompted the command, "Turn around." The orders reverberated throughout the fleet. Return to the sea, Yukjon course. However, it's impossible to maneuver 400 warships instantly, especially within a river channel that was rapidly diminishing in depth. The vanguard ships attempted to pivot, colliding with those trailing them. Captains bellowed contradictory instructions. Ropes became entangled. The formation dissolved into disarray as the tide relentlessly continued to fall. More stakes surfaced. The water level dropped with that peculiar rapidity unique to tidal rivers, seemingly peeling away from the hulls of the ensnared vessels, as if the river itself were abandoning them. What had been a navigable waterway just 30 minutes earlier was transforming into a perilous thicket of wooden spikes. The first ship to be impaled likely made an overly sharp turn, or perhaps it simply had the misfortune of being directly above one of the larger stakes when the tide receded past a critical threshold. The stake, 3 or 4 meters tall, driven deeply into the riverbed and angled at 45 degrees toward the river mouth, punctured the hull like a spear tearing through paper. The wood splintered with a sound akin to a tree cracking during a storm, and water immediately began to gush through the breach. The ship lurched, its center of gravity shifting as water inundated the hold. Desperate men clambered across the listing deck, screaming, striving to reach the sides before the vessel capsized entirely. Then another ship struck the stakes, and then another. The heavier the ship, the more violently it came down as the tide retreated. Yun warships, designed for ocean combat with deep keels and reinforced hulls, were particularly susceptible. They rode lower in the water than the agile Vietnamese craft, meaning they encountered the stakes sooner and with greater force as the water level dropped. Some stakes perforated from below, while others angled sideways, ensnared ships attempting to steer clear of the primary stake field, tearing open gashes along their length. The zigzag formation devised by Tran Hung Dao ensured there was no safe direction. Veer left, hit stakes. Veer right, hit stakes. Attempt to reverse, hit more stakes. The entire river channel had become an inescapable death trap. Crews abandoned their ships, plunging into the water, hoping to swim to the banks. But the water was no longer deep enough for swimming. It was knee-deep in some places, thigh-deep in others, with treacherous currents and a mucky riverbed that gripped their feet with every step. Armored men found themselves trapped in the mud, unable to advance or retreat, slowly sinking as they struggled. The Mongol ships began to collide with each other. In the pandemonium of attempting to reverse course, captains had lost all formation integrity. Ships that managed to evade the stakes crashed into those that hadn't. Oars shattered and hulls splintered from the impacts. On some vessels, desperate crews tried to beach themselves on the riverbanks, believing that even capture was preferable to drowning. But the banks of the Bạch Đằng were not convenient sandy shores. They were muddy reeds and treacherous footing that offered no genuine safety. The tide receded further. More stakes emerged. Ships that had merely run aground suddenly found themselves impaled as stakes that had been just beneath their keels rose to meet them. The cacophony must have been horrifying. Wood cracking, men screaming, officers shouting commands that no one could obey. And beneath it all, that steady, relentless sound of water receding from around the hulls, leaving ships stranded on those wooden spikes like fish in a drained pond. And then, from both riverbanks, the Vietnamese launched their assault. From positions meticulously prepared and manned in advance, Tran Hung Dao's ground forces initiated fire, with arrows leading the attack. Waves of arrows rained down on the beleaguered ships, trapping them in a lethal deluge. The Mongol crews struggled to retaliate effectively. Their vessels pitched and swayed precariously, making it difficult to maintain balance, with much of their focus on avoiding a fall into the churning water or being crushed between colliding hulls. Next came the fire arrows, their flaming tips lodging in the wooden decks and sails, igniting rapidly spreading conflagrations in the arid spring air. Those ships not impaled on stakes soon succumbed to the flames. The crews faced an impossible dilemma: remain on a burning ship or leap into the shallow, muddy waters where Vietnamese soldiers lay in wait. Rocks and flammable objects barraged the fleet. The Vietnamese had strategically positioned these materials along the banks for just this purpose. Every piece of combustible debris that could be hurled or launched at the trapped ships was now deployed. Individual fires merged into massive infernos. Smoke intensified the chaos, severely impairing visibility and hindering Mongol commanders' attempts to coordinate any organized resistance. Vietnamese infantry advanced into the shallows, moving with the confidence of those fighting on familiar terrain. They wielded weapons specifically designed for close-quarters combat in water and mud. They navigated the mire with ease, while their adversaries, exhausted, demoralized, and literally trapped, became easy targets. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. The tide ebbed around midday. By then, the main channel of the Bạch Đằng resembled a shipyard ravaged by an earthquake, with hundreds of wooden stakes, now fully exposed, protruding from the riverbed at various angles. Impaled upon these stakes were Mongol warships in various states of ruin. Some had been breached from below and were sinking into the mud. Others had capsized, their keels pointing skyward. Still others burned fiercely, sending plumes of black smoke into the afternoon sky. Bodies floated in the residual water or lay strewn in the mud. Some Mongol soldiers attempted to surrender, casting aside their weapons and pleading for mercy. A few were taken prisoner. Others were cut down on the spot, as in the heat and confusion of battle, restraint is not always a given. The Vietnamese had months of invasion and devastation to avenge. Admiral Omar himself was captured at some point during this catastrophe. Historical accounts do not specify the exact timing or circumstances, only that he was taken alive, suggesting either extraordinary fortune or a deliberate effort by Vietnamese forces to apprehend him rather than kill him. Prisoners held value, and the captured admiral, especially one of Omar's stature, possessed considerable worth. By sunset, the Battle of Bạch Đằng concluded. Casualty figures from various sources differ wildly, as is common for medieval battles, but the most conservative estimates place Mongol losses at tens of thousands killed or captured. Some Vietnamese chronicles claim 300,000 men killed or captured, which seems impossibly high until one considers that this figure likely encompasses not only sailors and marines, but also the infantry escorts and support personnel accompanying the fleet. The material losses were undeniable. 400 Mongol warships. Some were utterly destroyed, either impaled and sunk or burned to the waterline. Others were seized largely intact, though damaged. 100 warships were destroyed. 400 in total were rendered inoperative. The entire naval component of the Third Mongol invasion was annihilated in a single day. The disaster was capped off a few days later when Zhang Wenhu, commanding the supply fleet intended to reinforce the invasion, finally approached Van Keep. Unaware of the battle at Bạch Đằng or Togon's retreat into China, he sailed his supply vessels directly into the same river system, now entirely under Vietnamese control. His fleet was also obliterated. Zhang himself managed to escape with a handful of soldiers, fleeing all the way back to Hainan. However, his supplies, the food and equipment that might have salvaged something from the invasion, either sank or fell into Vietnamese hands. Within a span of a few months, Vietnam had vanquished 3 major Mongol forces: Togon's ground army, Omar's combat fleet, and Zhang's supply train. The third invasion was over, ending in a catastrophe so profound it defied belief, all due to wooden stakes hidden in a riverbed. When news reached Kublai Khan's court in China, the emperor's reaction was furious. Consider Kublai's standing at this juncture in his life. He was Genghis Khan's grandson, the ruler who had completed the conquest of China and established the Yuan dynasty. He had defeated the Southern Song, one of the most sophisticated states in the medieval world. He presided over the largest contiguous empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe. He stood out as one of his era's most accomplished rulers by any judicious assessment. Yet, for the third time, this modest Southeast Asian realm had vanquished his forces. This instance, however, transcended a mere defeat. It was a total obliteration. 400 warships vanished, along with tens of thousands of soldiers. His son, Togon, who had commanded the ground units, was struck by a poisoned projectile and forced to flee through the jungle like any common criminal. Kublai's fury against Togon was swift and absolute. He consigned his own son to lifelong banishment in Yangzhou, with strict orders never to see him again. It wasn't imprisonment, for Togon remained a prince, but a permanent exclusion from court, stripped of any prospect of military command or political sway. This was the severest penalty Kublai could impose short of execution, and he did so unhesitatingly. The message rang clear. Such monumental failure would not be tolerated, even from kin, especially from kin. However, the individual Kublai most desired to retrieve was Omar. Not for punishment, but for repatriation. Omar held significant value. He was the admiral instrumental in the conquest of the Song dynasty. His experience and expertise were irreplaceable. While he had indeed lost the fleet, he had been acting under orders, implementing a strategy that Togon had mishandled on land. Moreover, he was still alive, suggesting he could potentially lead another naval campaign. The Vietnamese, initially, expressed a willingness to negotiate. King Tran Han Tong put forth a settlement. Vietnam would formally accept tributary status under the Yuan dynasty, providing regular tribute and acknowledging Yuan supremacy, if Kublai Khan would abandon his conquest ambitions and release Vietnamese captives. This was a face-saving compromise, allowing Vietnam to maintain internal autonomy while China asserted nominal suzerainty. Part of these discussions included the return of captured Yuan officers and soldiers. In 1289, King Tran Nha Nong consented to Omar's return home. The admiral was placed on a ship bound for China. All indications pointed toward a peaceful resolution until the ship sank. It simply sank. Somewhere between Vietnam and China, the vessel carrying Omar back to Kublai's court disappeared beneath the waves, and the admiral drowned. Now ships do sink. It's a fact of life, particularly in the medieval period when navigation was imprecise and ship construction varied. Yet, Vietnamese historical records are quite explicit about the true course of events. Prince Tran Hung Dao, who had initially opposed Omar's return, orchestrated the ship's sinking. He intentionally had the vessel scuttled, ensuring his captured adversary's death rather than allowing him to return to China, where he might lead another invasion armada. Whether King Tran Nannong was aware of this or it happened against his wishes remains unclear. The sources suggest the king genuinely sought peace and was prepared to make concessions to achieve it. And while Tran Hung Dao maintained his conviction that a good Mongol commander was a dead one, regardless, Omar drowned. Upon receiving this news, Kublai lost what remaining composure he possessed. Historical chronicles depict him descending into a frenzy bordering on insanity. He swore to erase Vietnam from existence. He immediately commenced planning a fourth invasion, one that would make the previous three seem like mere reconnaissance missions. This would be total warfare, complete annihilation. He would depopulate the entire nation if necessary. No more limited campaigns with specific objectives, just pure destruction. And frankly, I empathize. Place yourself in Kublai's shoes. You've subjugated China, the most refined, populous, and affluent state in Asia. You've extended Mongol influence to its absolute zenith. You're presiding over an empire that spans continents. You've navigated rebellions, succession disputes, and administrative challenges that would crush lesser rulers. Yet this single small kingdom in Southeast Asia consistently defies you, repeatedly defeats your armies, and perpetually humiliates your generals. And now, they've not only destroyed your fleet, but have assassinated the admiral you most wished to retrieve, in what was undeniably a calculated political murder. The sheer disrespect alone would have justified another invasion in Kublai's estimation. Factor in the strategic implications, Vietnam's geographical position controlling vital trade routes, its potential as a base for further operations in Southeast Asia, and a new campaign seemed unavoidable. However, Kublai Khan never launched that fourth invasion. In 1294, 6 years after Bạch Đằng, Kublai Khan passed away. He was almost 80, an advanced age for that era. His death occurred before he could organize the massive punitive expedition he had envisioned. With his demise, the entire political landscape shifted. Kublai's successor was Tu Khan, his grandson, who adopted a markedly different approach to the Vietnamese issue. Temur announced that the war with Giet was over, concluded, finished. He initiated a diplomatic mission to Vietnam with the goal of re-establishing positive relations. The era of invasions and military campaigns was over, replaced by a formal tributary arrangement where Vietnam would acknowledge Yuan supremacy in exchange for autonomy. Why this shift? Partially because Timur faced his own domestic political challenges and couldn't justify expending resources on what was clearly a losing endeavor. Additionally, 3 successive defeats had demonstrated that Vietnam simply could not be subjugated with the resources the Yuan Empire was prepared to commit. I also suspect that even the Mongols eventually realized that some objectives aren't worth the cost of their attainment. Vietnam never dispatched a king or prince to the Yuan court, a significant point of contention during negotiations. Kublai had demanded this as a clear symbol of genuine submission. However, the Tran dynasty maintained the outward appearance of tributary status while preserving complete internal independence. They offered some tribute and sent a few diplomatic delegations, yet they never genuinely submitted in any meaningful sense. Consequently, the Mongols never again invaded Vietnam, neither under Timur nor his successors. The Yuan dynasty persisted until 1368, another approximately 70 years, and throughout that entire period, they never made another attempt to conquer the kingdom that had thrice humbled them. The historical irony is almost poetic. The Mongol Empire, which had conquered territories from Korea to Hungary and vanquished every major military power it encountered, was brought to a standstill by wooden stakes embedded in a river. The sophisticated Yuan military, with its advanced technology and seasoned commanders, was defeated by a tactic that was already 350 years old when it was employed. If you had informed Kublai Khan at the zenith of his power that his invasion of Vietnam would be thwarted by wooden poles driven into a riverbed, he would have scoffed at the notion. If you had told Admiral Omar, as he sailed into the Bạch Đằng that April morning in 1288, that he was about to be destroyed by a weapon his expertise led him to disregard, he would have considered you unhinged. Yet, that is precisely what transpired. Sometimes, the supposed experts are mistaken. Sometimes, advanced technology succumbs to simple, perfectly executed tactics. Sometimes, ancient methods succeed precisely because of their antiquity, having been tested, refined, and proven over centuries. And occasionally, just occasionally, the people you've dismissed as primitive and inferior prove to be far more astute than you imagined. The Mongols learned their lesson at Bạch Đằng, but the tuition was exorbitant. The Battle of Bạch Đằng was no accident. General Trần Hưng Đạo didn't simply get lucky. Admiral Omar didn't make a monumental blunder. This was a masterpiece of strategic planning, meticulous preparation, and flawless execution. Trần Hưng Đạo grasped a fundamental truth about warfare that Omar had evidently overlooked. Trần Hưng Đạo applied rigorous observation and precise measurement to forge a weapon meticulously calibrated for its specific environment. The week spent studying the Bạch Đằng tides constituted a legitimate hydrographic survey. He precisely measured water depths hour by hour, calculated the ebb and flow of tides, determined the rate of water level changes, identified areas of strongest and weakest currents, and meticulously mapped the riverbed topography. His prediction was that if he could entice the Mongol fleet into the river at high tide and detain them until the tide receded, their ships would become ensnared. Stakes strategically positioned at specific angles would snag vessels maneuvering in various directions. Vietnamese boats, being lighter and having shallow drafts, would navigate past the stakes, while the heavier Mongol warships would be trapped. He was correct on every single point. That was pure calculation, not chance. Admiral Omar, on the other hand, relied on his experience, but also on assumptions that had not been scrutinized against this particular situation. He was familiar with naval warfare from the Chinese coast, which involved different rivers and distinct conditions. His experience suggested that Vietnamese boats were inferior to Yuan ships in open water. Retreating via river seemed safer than an overland escape. There appeared no need to concern himself with 350-year-old tactics. All these assumptions were reasonable, but utterly incorrect for Bạch Đằng. In April 1288, Trần Hưng Đạo had laborers drive hundreds of stakes into the riverbed during freezing rain and low-tide windows, maintaining absolute secrecy for weeks. Each stake had to be positioned at precise angles with correct spacing, forming overlapping kill zones. Naval commanders were tasked with engaging a superior enemy force, sustaining casualties, and then retreating on command, luring the Mongols into the trap without exhibiting genuine panic or breaking formation. This was an exceedingly difficult feat. Ground forces had to remain concealed for hours, observing enemy ships pass, awaiting the signal to attack without prematurely revealing their position. Everything had to converge simultaneously: the tide at the correct level, the Mongol fleet in the precise position, and all forces ready. Failure of even one element would cause the entire plan to collapse. But nothing failed. Everything unfolded exactly as designed. Trần Hưng Đạo understood Omar's overconfidence and exploited it ruthlessly. Admiral Omar, having previously bested the Song dynasty's naval forces, pursued Vietnamese monarchs to sea and commanded advanced 13th-century vessels. From his viewpoint, Vietnamese combat strategies were well understood. He anticipated guerrilla warfare, swift attacks, and harassment. They would not confront him directly, because a head-on battle would be unwinnable for them. So when Vietnamese boats appeared and then retreated, Omar perceived precisely what he expected to see. Confirmation bias exerted a powerful influence. We tend to observe what we anticipate. Omar expected the Vietnamese to flee, and their flight therefore raised no questions for him. General Tran Hung Dao weaponized this overconfidence, providing Omar with precisely what he expected until the tide receded, transforming those expectations into a deadly trap. The Bạch Đằng River was not merely any waterway, it was almost perfectly suited for this particular tactic. Significant tidal variations led to dramatic fluctuations in water levels. Numerous tributaries and a complex landscape made navigation difficult even without additional hazards. The riverbed was sufficiently firm to securely hold stakes, yet not overly rocky to prevent their insertion. Had Omar chosen a different escape route, one with minimal tides or deep channels navigable at low tide, this strategy would have failed. The environment itself rendered the weapon effective. Tran Hung Dao simply had to recognize this and devise his tactics around that inherent characteristic. The Mongols, despite their military brilliance, occasionally struggled with this fundamental insight. They conquered the steppes through mobility and cavalry, and subjugated China by adapting to siege warfare and incorporating Chinese expertise. However, they found themselves challenged in environments that negated their core advantages. The Vietnamese jungles, where cavalry was useless and heat exhaustion a constant threat, or the Japanese typhoons that twice decimated their invasion fleets, demonstrated that terrain can sometimes be more significant than technology or training. The stakes alone did not destroy the Mongol fleet. They merely immobilized it. Fire arrows then decimated the fleet, while ground troops dispatched the stranded crews. The shallow water prevented any escape. A psychological shock shattered Mongol morale. Each tactical component amplified the others. Impaled on stakes, ships could not maneuver to evade fire arrows. The fire compelled crews into the water, where ground troops lay in wait. The sheer impossibility of escape and the horrifying spectacle of their fleet trapped on wooden spikes triggered panic, making organized resistance impossible. This was the sophistication Omar overlooked. He saw wooden stakes and dismissed them as a primitive tool. He should have recognized a complex, interconnected system of tactical elements, each meticulously crafted to compensate for Vietnamese weaknesses and exploit Mongol vulnerabilities. Technology does not win wars, strategy does. Superior weaponry is advantageous. It provides benefits, but it is not the ultimate decider. What truly matters is aligning your capabilities with the actual situation. Omar brought advanced warships to a conflict that demanded comprehension of tidal river dynamics. He applied naval expertise developed against Chinese admirals to a battle with Vietnamese guerrilla tacticians. He brought assumptions about warfare to an environment where those assumptions proved dangerous. Tran Hung Dao, conversely, brought wooden stakes to a tidal river and emerged victorious. The experts were mistaken. Ancient tactics were, in fact, correct. That primitive weapon was, in reality, the perfect instrument for this specific battle, in this specific location, against this specific adversary. 400 Mongol warships bore the cost of that valuable lesson. In 1953, Vietnamese laborers constructing a dike in Yen Giang Commune, Quang Ninh Province, struck something hard while excavating riverbed mud. It was wood, ancient, dark, and weathered, yet still remarkably solid after centuries submerged in salt water and mud. They had discovered the stakes, hundreds of them, driven deep into the riverbed, precisely where Tran Hung Dao's forces had placed them 665 years prior. Some stood upright, others angled between 15 and 45 degrees, still positioned to impale ships from multiple directions. They measured from 2 to 5 meters in length, their sharpened ends remarkably intact. This discovery created a considerable stir in Vietnam. Archaeological teams were immediately dispatched. Careful excavation revealed stakes arranged in a zigzag pattern, spaced 0.9 to 1.5 meters apart, exactly as historical chronicles described. Some had broken tops, and some still displayed traces of iron sheathing, albeit corroded. The wood itself was ironwood, an incredibly dense material renowned for its resistance to rot, surpassing nearly any other timber in Southeast Asia. Official excavations commenced in 1959, uncovering more stakes, pottery shards, bricks, and 13th-century artifacts. In 1988, to mark the 700th anniversary, the Vietnamese government formally designated the Bạch Đằng Stake Yard a National Historic Site. In 2012, Bạch Đằng Giang was elevated to a special National Historical Relic. Then, between 2019 and 2020, archaeological surveys near Hue discovered additional stake fields, larger than previously known, indicating that defensive preparations were even more extensive than historians had realized. Today, a selection of these stakes can be viewed at the National Museum of Vietnamese History in Hanoi. These seemingly mundane artifacts, mere wooden posts darkened by time and smoothed by water, appear unremarkable at first glance. Their lack of distinction, however, is precisely what makes them significant. They represent not advanced weaponry or lost knowledge, but rather the fundamental tools humanity has employed for millennia: simple wooden stakes. Their effectiveness stems from their precise application, the correct placement, the opportune moment, and the suitable adversary. The Battle of Bạch Đằng became a cornerstone of Vietnamese national identity, transcending its status as a mere military triumph studied in classrooms and commemorated with monuments. It stands as an enduring emblem of Vietnamese resilience against foreign incursions, ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds, and their unwavering resolve to utilize available resources to safeguard their autonomy. During the era of French colonial dominance, Vietnamese nationalists drew inspiration from Bạch Đằng. It served as concrete evidence that Vietnam could overcome a considerably mightier foreign power through shrewdness, tenacity, and a masterful understanding of its landscape. In the context of the American War, North Vietnamese strategists explicitly cited Bạch Đằng as a prime example. General Von Nguyen Giap, the mastermind behind the Tet Offensive and numerous major campaigns, meticulously studied Tran Hung Dao's strategies. The core lesson remained constant. A technologically dominant invading force can be vanquished by a defender who possesses a superior grasp of the local environment, is prepared to employ unconventional methods, and demonstrates the patience required to execute intricate plans over extended durations. To fully appreciate this extraordinary feat, one must consider the formidable power of the Mongol Empire in 1288, which spanned from Korea to Hungary. They had subdued Khwarezm, dismantled the Islamic Caliphate, devastated Eastern Europe, subjugated Russia, and finally brought down the Song dynasty after decades of conflict. This represented the largest contiguous empire in human history, governing over 100 million individuals. Every significant power they encountered succumbed to their might. The Jin, Khwarezm, Kievan Rus, Eastern European kingdoms, and the Song, some of the most sophisticated states in the medieval world with centuries of military tradition and advanced technology, all fell before the Mongols. Yet they could not conquer Vietnam. 3 attempts, 3 resounding defeats. The third failure at Bạch Đằng was so comprehensive and devastating that they never again dared to invade. Kublai Khan died still harboring plans for a 4th invasion, but his successors abandoned the notion entirely. Vietnam thus joins a select group of nations that successfully resisted Mongol conquest. Japan achieved this twice, aided by typhoons that obliterated invasion fleets. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt halted the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, preventing their expansion into Africa. And Vietnam accomplished it 3 times, the final victory secured with wooden stakes and the strategic use of tidal rivers. This battle unequivocally illustrates the limitations of advanced military technology when employed without a profound understanding of local conditions. The Yuan dynasty possessed some of the most cutting-edge military technology of the 13th century. Composite bows with incredible range and penetration, siege engines capable of leveling fortified cities, nascent gunpowder weapons, and ships crafted by Chinese artisans with centuries of naval architectural expertise. None of this mattered at Bạch Đằng. All that technological prowess, specialized knowledge, and extensive experience became irrelevant when applied to an environment that neutralized its inherent advantages. Modern militaries continue to grapple with this fundamental challenge. American forces in Vietnam during the 1960s and 70s possessed overwhelming technological superiority, including helicopters, jet aircraft, artillery, and the world's most advanced communication systems. Yet, they were defeated by an adversary employing tactics largely unchanged since Tran Hung Dao's era. Soviet forces in Afghanistan in the 1980s, equipped with tanks, helicopter gunships, and modern weapon systems, similarly lost to Mujahideen fighters utilizing decades-old weaponry and, at times, centuries-old strategies. Technology alone does not guarantee victory in warfare. It must be applied appropriately in contexts where it provides genuine advantages. When engaged in an environment that negates those advantages, even the most advanced technology in the world will prove futile. Admiral Omar learned this critical lesson. The Yuan dynasty also learned it. Many subsequent militaries have learned the same lesson, often through painful experience. Wooden stakes remain effective if employed correctly. Ancient methods still hold value if one grasps their original purpose. And occasionally, just occasionally, those deemed primitive and inferior can impart an unforgettable lesson in warfare. Vietnam certainly taught the Mongols that lesson at Bạch Đằng with wooden stakes in the spring of 1288. We are reminded that the Mongol Empire, which had conquered vast territories from Korea to Hungary and vanquished every major power it encountered, was brought to a standstill by a kingdom presumed to be an easy target. Sometimes the experts are mistaken. Sometimes sophisticated technology is overcome by simple tactics executed flawlessly. And sometimes the old ways prevail precisely because they are old, because they have been rigorously tested, refined, and proven over countless centuries. The naval superiority belonged to the Mongols, yet Vietnam possessed strategic intellect. While the Mongols boasted advanced naval engineering, Vietnam demonstrated a profound grasp of its native terrain. The Mongols harbored self-assurance born of perpetual triumphs, but Vietnam was driven by the acute peril of resisting a triple invasion and its unwavering refusal to yield. Ultimately, intellect outmaneuvered raw engineering, local knowledge triumphed over generalized experience, grim resolve overcame arrogance, and crude wooden pilings vanquished formidable warships. Such is the chronicle of Bạch Đằng. Such is the enduring wisdom of April 9, 1288. It explains why, after 737 years, we continue to recount the day the vast Mongol Empire sailed into a river and met its demise. If this narrative resonated with you, if you found yourself championing those submerged wooden spikes as they pierced the surface, if your perception of understated technology has been forever altered, then assist me in disseminating this account. Please click the like button, subscribe to this platform, and share your thoughts on other historical instances where the underdog prevailed through ingenuity rather than sheer force. Because history abounds with such scenarios where all conventional predictions failed to materialize, where professional opinions were thoroughly debunked, where populations dismissed as unsophisticated or inferior imparted an unforgettable lesson to civilizations proclaiming themselves advanced. These tales warrant broad dissemination, and I am merely beginning to share them. I appreciate your viewership.